Welcome back to our Navigating Conversations video series, and I hope you've enjoyed the first few videos that we've been able to navigate through the importance of conversations, how to actually have small talk and conversations, and then how to navigate more difficult ones as you are talking with individuals. In this part of the series, I want to talk about some of the things you can do in a small group that can help to navigate some more difficult conversations during your group times. So, addressing conflicts in your group time is something that is a vital skill to the health of your small group overall. And there are three main factors that are there when it comes to preventing conflict in the midst of your small groups. What I like to say is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And really that's what we're trying to do in the midst of these three things in our small groups. The first is to set boundaries on conversation. What are the things that are okay to talk about, and what are the things that are crossing the line? These are something that you can actually do at the beginning of a study to say, what are these guardrails, the boundaries that when we cross over, we can agree together that we've set that boundary and therefore come back to the correct side in order to prevent conflict in the midst of your group. Some of these things are politics. That's a pretty obvious one. Heated theology topics. If the study is not specifically about a topic of theology, then one of the things you can do is to set guardrails to say, this is what's in limits and this is what is out of bounds. That's something that's pretty important when it comes to setting that. Always being respectful is another boundary. If somebody is disrespectful, that's a very clear crossing of the boundary. And that's something that needs to be addressed because ultimately what we're trying to do in small groups is we're building relationship. We're building connection with one another. And if somebody is disrespectful, there's nothing worse that makes somebody want to not come back to a small group. It's hard enough to get people to commit to it. We don't need somebody who's disrespectful to prevent others who are wanting to learn and wanting to build relationship to enter into that kind of setting. Have a signal or phrase when that boundary is crossed. It could be something like a timeout, but make sure it's something that's not subtle. You know how if you did something wrong at home and you expected to get a stare from mom, it took you some time to recognize that stare in the midst of your life. It could be something that's subtle in the midst of a small group. So have a phrase or have a signal that says, you know what, I think we've crossed over one of those boundaries that we've established. Let's go back to keeping the main thing the main thing. Lastly, gossip about others or the church is a very clear boundary that you need to make sure to set in the midst of your small group. If somebody has an issue with somebody else in the church or with the church in and of itself, cut that off in the midst of your small group time. Say, hey, I think we're getting into a point where we might be reaching into gossip. If you have a problem with somebody else or if you have a problem with the church, please go and talk with that individual or with a pastor at the church. That has to be taken care of pretty immediately, and we have that in the group leader agreement as well. But we want to be a resource to you to help in the midst of that. When somebody comes into a small group that's gossipy, that's cliquey, they're not going to get connected. I don't want to refer somebody to a small group knowing if there's gossip going on. That is a group killer in the midst of the church and is not acceptable. So setting boundaries on your conversations or on what's acceptable in the midst of your group time is very important. The second thing is it's okay to give reminders of staying on topic. The way that I like to put it is, are we keeping the main thing the main thing? So it's not a bad thing to have people who wander in the midst of conversations, but it is when it causes frustration. Oftentimes, if you're feeling frustration as a group leader, if somebody is dominating the conversation with rabbit trails, you're not the only one that's feeling that frustration. But the others may pull out of the group because of that. When you're addressing somebody who is wandering, go ahead and use a phrase like this. I appreciate what you had to say in the midst of that area. I think we're getting a little off topic though, so let's bring it back to the main point that we were talking about earlier. It's simple, and it can feel like you're butting into what they're saying, but you're also helping to redirect the conversation back to what you're actually talking about. And this happens in all small groups, whether it's support groups, whether it's fellowship groups, discipleship groups, they all deal with this issue. Third, provide an environment where people don't feel left out. There are two kinds of people. There are speakers and there are soakers. The speakers are the ones who are verbal processors. They're the ones that tend to talk in the midst of small group times. They might be extroverts, but they might not. They might just simply like to process out loud. The other people are soakers. They're the ones that are taking in everything that people are saying. They're taking in the scripture passages, the questions, and they're thinking deeply about them because they're internal processors. However, sometimes those internal processors can feel like they're left out in the midst of small group discussion. One of the tools that you can utilize as a small group leader is to help elevate those soakers and to make sure that the speakers can give them enough space to do so. For example, if somebody you know is a soaker in your small group and you see that the wheels are turning, that maybe they've got a face on them where you can see a furrowed brow, or they might be looking up at the sky and scratching their chin, but they're not saying anything. That could be an indicator that they have something to say, but they may not have the space to do it. So go ahead and say, Allison, it looks like you're thinking of something that is a little challenging. Would you be willing to share with us as the group? And that gives her the space to be able to open up. Fill in the blank with any other name that you've got for your small group members, but this can help them to feel not left out. This is a vital part in maintaining small group conversations. So those are the preventative things that you can do in a small group. Make sure to set up boundaries for your conversation. Make sure to give reminders of staying on topic, and then make sure to provide an environment where people don't feel left out. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. There may come a point where you have to address open conflict in the midst of a group setting. So, remember this phrase coined by Dr. John Deloney, one of my favorite authors, and he's a crisis and trauma counselor and a Christian that works with Ramsey Solutions down in Tennessee. He has this phrase, choose guilt over resentment. Now, what does that mean? It's better to feel guilty about addressing an issue with an individual than to not deal with it and build up resentment. Guilt is the feeling of responsibility or remorse for some offense, crime, wrong, etc., whether it's real or imagined. You kind of feel like you're offending somebody if you're calling out an action that they're doing that's harming the group. But if you don't deal with it, it leads to resentment, which is the feeling of displeasure or indignation at some act, remark, person, etc. that's causing injury or insult. Imagine in that point, resentment is letting something fester. It's an infection that you're not addressing. And feeling guilty is the antibiotic to it. It's helping to heal that frustration, that festering, and that other person may not even be aware that what they were doing was causing that. But there are ways that we can do that in a group setting and in an individual setting. For the most part, if you are experiencing these issues in a group setting, make sure to utilize that timeout feature and share with that person. Can we talk about this afterwards with each other one-on-one? It's okay to choose guilt over resentment in that moment. Say your group time has ended and you're now with that individual. One of the things that you can do, remember what Allison taught you in our previous videos of how to address conversations one-on-one. When you're in the moment, you haven't been able to write up a response. You haven't really been able to prepare. You can remember this thing from Nonviolent Communication. It's an acronym, and Nonviolent Communication is a book by Marshall Rosenberg that basically seeks to give you tools to navigate these kinds of conversations, especially when it comes to separating out an action from the person. When we say we love the sinner, but we hate the sin, this is the same exact process that we're doing. We are separating that person who is made in the image of God and whom God loves from the action that is causing harm, what we would call sin. So, when you're addressing that, there are 4 things to keep in mind from nonviolent communication. The first is observation. You've observed an action that this person has done that has led to the conflict. Focus on the action in and of itself and make that specific action known to the offender. Second, the feeling that you or your group members have because of that action. When the behavior occurs, how does this make you feel? Feelings are not necessarily the driver in our seats. Instead, they are indicators. And what a feeling is indicating is that there's something wrong here. It could be frustration, it could be anger, it could be fill in the blank, but make that feeling known. And when you're having that feeling, it leads us to that next part, which is need. Observation, feeling, and need. What is the need? Or another word you could use is value that is not being met in the midst of this action. It could be a need for security. It could be a need for connection. And if somebody has been disrespectful in a group time, that need for security and connection has been broken. Make that known and make that clear to the person. Last but not least is to request something that changes that action. We observe, there's feeling, there's the need that needs addressed, and then there is the request. This is where you can be really clear about how that action should change so that you are able to make sure that the small group is in a healthy place and that your relationship with them is in a healthy place too. This is one of the best tools that I've been able to utilize in my own pastoral journey, in my marriage, in all sorts of different relationships, to be able to separate out the unwanted action from the person that is made in the image of God. If you want to look more into that, feel free to pick up the book Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg, or you can also go to cvnc.org, which is the Nonviolent Communications website. They have a lot of really great pointers, and it is a skill that just takes development to learn. By going through the book and by practicing it in your conversations with folks throughout your time, it can be a really helpful tool for you to address these kind of conflicts in the future. This can also be utilized alongside of Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 16. And this is classically what we utilize here in the church to say, what is the point in which we have to deal with this conflict? And what is the point to say enough is enough? Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 18 says this: "If another believer sins against you, go privately and point out the offense. If the other person listens and confesses it, you have won that person back." This is usually where it stops. It's just making it known that there was an offense of some kind, and how can we work this out one-on-one? That tends to be where most things are addressed well. If you are unsuccessful, take one or two others with you and go back again so that everything you say may be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. This is the second phase. So you've addressed it one-on-one individually, and make sure to write that down. Write down the date, write down some notes from that meeting, and just keep a record of it. The second time, this is one of the reasons why I often have co-leaders for groups. If you have a co-leader, you have another person who can A, check yourself out to see if it's an issue with you as a leader or if it truly is an issue with the person in this small group. If it is, you two as leaders can go and address this person and act as witnesses for that. Once again, make sure to write down when you've done that, take some notes on the meeting, and just have a written record as to what has gone on. Hopefully they'll listen to you if it's more than one person. Then we move on to the latter part of these verses. If the person still refuses to listen, then take your case to the church. Then if he or she won't accept the church's decision, treat that person as a pagan or a corrupt tax collector. Now that sounds pretty harsh. Essentially, we're kind of kicking somebody out of the church, and that's not popular nowadays. But at the same time, we need to recognize that sin is an infection. Sin is a cancer. We want people to help be restored, and we want to walk alongside of them in that. And that's why we come along them privately, then with 2 people and witnesses, and then with the church, because we want to give them as many opportunities to repent as possible. However, if it's come to the point where it's just unable to happen, then we as the church, mainly me as the pastor of small groups, will step in and help you with that. Unfortunately, we may have to remove that person from the group, but one of the things that I mentioned earlier is by keeping written record of those moments when you've had those hard conversations, I'll be able to see that history and be able to basically talk with that person and say, look, this has been brought up multiple times by multiple people. So if it ever comes to that point, I am a resource for you in the midst of that. Thankfully, I've never had to do that yet in the midst of my tenure here at Christ Wesleyan. But if it does come to that, here is the way that we deal with that conflict in the midst of a small group. As we finish up this series on navigating conversations, there's one biblical story that I want you to leave with. Because yes, navigating conversations are difficult. And one of the reasons why they are difficult is there's a risk that the person may not listen to us. But we happen to see many different biblical examples of when this has happened. The most prominent one, in my opinion, is the story of the prodigal son. Navigating conversations are hard, but without the risk, we don't have the reward of what those relationships bring. Well, thanks so much for joining us for this Navigating Conversations video series. I appreciate you spending some time with us here on this YouTube platform, and feel free to share this with other people in the church or even outside of the church. These skills of conversations are something that's valuable to our whole community, especially those other churches. And if you want to spread that into the midst of the congregation, feel free to share that. Feel free to subscribe to our CWC Groups channel as well, where more group leader tips are coming, and we want to continue to equip and train you for how we can help you through your small groups and navigating some of the challenges that come with that.